Glasgow Police Museum contains many exhibits that testify to the city's darker side. One item is particularly striking. It's a woman's footprint in blood. This was the key piece of evidence in a murder case that shocked Victorian Glasgow.
The Sandford Place Murder is one of the most enduring cases in Scottish criminal history. And the fact that the murder remains unsolved 150 years on gives it an added cachet.
Jessie McLachlan was unfortunate. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
It really depends on whose story you believe. Only two people know what really happened.
She'd witnessed a very good friend dying. And not only had she lost that friend, but her friend had died in really dreadful circumstances.
If she'd been in England, under English law, she could have still been convicted of murder, perhaps, as an accessory after the fact. In Scotland, that cannot happen.
A woman very much alone as she faces the wrath of the Scottish legal system.
In the early hours of Saturday, July the 5th, 1862, three sisters were walking along Sauchiehall Road, as it was then known. They were stopped in their tracks by the sound of a wailing from a nearby house. The sisters chose not to investigate. Had they done so, the identity of the Sandyford killer might have been revealed there and then. Was the wrong person framed for one of Glasgow's infamous square mile murders? The wailing woman was a servant for one of the wealthiest households in the area. She had been brutally attacked.
In the 1860s, the West End of Glasgow is in many ways similar as it is today. It's a very wealthy area, the home to many prosperous families, and very often in the Victorian era, this wealth was evidenced in the fact that many of the families had their own servants, their own in-house staff, and their own quarters where they lived to look after the house and the business of the house.
There wasn't established working protections for individuals. So workplace rights, employment rights as we know today, didn't really exist, and people of lower classes were commonly found to be in service until they married, in the case of women.
For advocate Claire Connolly, the crime scene at Sandyford Place brings this lost Glasgow story alive.
A des res in Sandyford Place would be looked upon as a step up the social ladder in those days. Nowadays, most of the buildings there are taken over as offices and other commercial premises, but at that time, most of the houses were inhabited by people of the business or entrepreneurial classes, professional people.
Jess McPherson was in service here in Sandyford Place in 1862. She had been a servant previously within the household, but had left and had spent 18 months in Manchester, and also had been out of service for another period of her life when she set up a shop with a good friend of hers. But she wasn't only just a servant here, she was very much the trusted servant.
She was actually also known as Jess Richardson. She was illegitimate, but she appears to have been a hard worker, and her bedroom was actually the laundry of the house at 17 Sandyford Place.
It's unclear if the family knew the full extent of Jessie's previous private life. It's recorded that she had two illegitimate children, one of whom was stillborn. It's not known where that other child was, who reared that other child. And certainly looking back at the papers, one would question whether those periods when she was absent from service here in Sandyford Place, at least at the period in Manchester, coincided with the birth of at least one of those children.
We first moved in, certainly for the first few years, and that was maybe the first 5 years, actually retaining cleaners was quite tricky.
Really?
Because, yeah, as soon as they got wind of the history of the building, they were away. So.
Oh dear.
In 1862, the lavish townhouse was owned by the Fleming family, originally from Aberdeenshire.
There were 3 generations of Flemings lived at 17 Sandyford Place. The patriarch of the family, and perhaps the most colourful character, was James Fleming, more commonly known as Old Fleming.
Old Fleming was a rough and ready type of man. He was initially a handloom weaver, but he had made some substantial amounts of money. He had set up his own manufacturing business, and his family had then acquired an interesting portfolio of properties. His son became an accountant, was well respected in the city, ran a large business, and he also helped his son collect the rents for these business.
So old man Fleming had established his business in Glasgow, and from that had accumulated some wealth, which had allowed him to educate his children. But his essential character didn't really change. He still spoke the Doric, much to the embarrassment of his family, and he was known to take a good drink. But that wasn't where the problematic aspects of James's character ended.
Old Fleming never really lost the habits of his young days, and his manners were perhaps rather crude and not what one would expect of people who'd aspired up into the middle classes. He was overfond of drink, but his worst sin perhaps was the fact that despite his advanced years, he had an eye for the ladies, and he had a reputation of being perhaps over tactile and over familiar with servants, especially female servants.
On one occasion, he had actually been taken before his church, the United Presbyterian in Anderson, not far from the house, and he was charged with fornication after a previous maid, Janet Dunsmore, had borne a child to him illegitimately.
Jess McPherson complained bitterly about his attentions. On one occasion she alleged that he'd come down to the servants' quarters and get into bed with her, and she told people that he was continually pestering her to marry him.
Jess was good friends with a young woman from the Highlands.
Jessie McLachlan was born in Inverness. She left there around about 15 when she came into domestic service in Glasgow. She worked for the Fleming family, and it was there that she met Jess McPherson. The two girls worked together there before Jessie had moved on to other premises, and she continued to be friendly with Jess and indeed visited her on several occasions at the house.
In 1862, Jessie McLachlan was 28 years of age. She was married to a man of the name James, who was a seaman, so he spent a period of time away from home and left Jessie in their home in the Brummelaw with their 3-year-old son.
He was a seaman, his wages weren't good, and Jessie had to augment her household income by taking in lodgers, pawning her property on a regular basis, and basically lived a life of just above the poverty line. They were always struggling to survive.
Jessie suffered from a heart condition that had grown worse after the birth of her only child. She had a fondness for glamorous clothes she could ill afford, but seems to have had no wish to return to domestic service. Meanwhile, her friend Jess remained the only female employee in a house of domineering men.
Jess seemed to have been very well liked by the other members of staff within the household, but she also appears to have been a capable woman and one that seemed to attract a fair amount of male attention. And indeed it's recorded that on one occasion when a police officer approached her and made some advances towards her, that she proceeded to pin him to the ground. So she was clearly a woman who had some physical strength about her, which presumably wouldn't be that unusual with people who worked in domestic service. It was hard work.
Most weekends, Mr. Fleming, the accountant, decamped to Dunoon, where the family owned a substantial villa which they used as a holiday home. Mr. Fleming often left on a Friday afternoon, taking his son with him, leaving old Fleming at home to be looked after by Jess.
We moved in here in May 1970, or started to sort of clean up and develop it from what it was before. And yeah, various books had obviously been out in the market, just outlining the square mile of murder, and which we read. Yeah, interesting.
It was in this room, but the building's changed because this would have been a dividing wall that's been removed.
Yeah, this was a complete solid wall here, and the main door entered here. And but apart from that, obviously the overall dimensions haven't really changed much. And she had her bed here.
Earlier in 1862, Jess McPherson had raised a complaint with the Flemings about the elderly James.
On one particular occasion, not long before Jess died, she reported that he had been drinking the previous day and on the particular Friday with a friend, and had come home drunk from town. And in the early hours of the morning, he climbed into bed with her and made advances towards her.
She had hoped that the old man may help fund her travels to Australia, which she had planned to do, and it may well be that her behaviour in some regards may have encouraged him to think that his advances may have been welcome.
What people may in the modern day call attempted rape, given that it was an unwanted advance very much. And after that, she was extremely distressed, and she met a good friend of hers who was with her husband at the time, and the friend noted that she looked very ill and very distressed, and Jess said that the old devil had done something to her.
The servant had arranged an evening with her good friend Jessie. Around 10 o'clock on the night of the 4th of July, McLachlan made her way to Sandford Place.
On the night of the murder, Jessie had left her premises at 182 Broomielaw and had spoken to her landlady on the way, who she had happened to see on the way out. She told her she was going to see Jess, her friend from all those years ago, and she was taking some rum and biscuits with her.
Old Fleming joined the two young women in the kitchen. He offered them whiskey.
There seems to be no question that a full-scale drinking session had taken place on the night of the murder, and whether anybody's recollections of events on that night were 100% could be open to question.
Now, during this time, there seemed to be a bit of not bickering, not open bickering between James and Jess, but certainly slight remarks, people saying things a little bit under their breath, that was noted by Jessie in a later statement that she gave.
The old man's whiskey had run out, and he'd dispatched Jessie to premises in North Street nearby, where she was trying to get more whiskey for him. Unfortunately, supplies were out, and she returned to the house. She tried to let herself in, but surprisingly, she found the door had been locked in her absence, and she had to knock to get in.
She knocked for some time, and eventually James Fleming came and opened the door. She went into the house with him, and there was no sign of Jess. He began to walk through towards the hallway, and she followed him, and then she heard groaning.
Jessie followed old Fleming downstairs to the basement and into Jess's bedroom. There, her friend was lying seriously injured.
At this time, she found that Jess McPherson had some facial injuries.
Her brow had been badly cut and was bleeding profusely, and there was also an injury in her nose. She dashed over to Jess. Jess was so badly injured and probably in shock by this point, she lay in a pool of blood and was barely able to speak. Jess raised her friend in her arms and attempted to offer some comfort to her and also to try and establish if she could help her. She duly washed Jess, got water. She told Fleming to get her water. She washed her face to wash away the blood and helped Jess to begin to come round a little bit, at which point Jess asked to be moved to the bed. Jessie wasn't able to do that on her own, and she got old Fleming to help her.
She alleged that the old Fleming had been making advances towards her, and when she'd rejected him, he had assaulted her.
As master of the house, old James Fleming refused to let Jessie McLachlan call a doctor.
His main concern was not with Jessie's health or the injuries she'd suffered, but was whether he would have to give an explanation of what he'd done to Jess.
Distressed by the serious condition of her friend, McLachlan attempted to leave and raise the alarm.
At one stage, while she was in a different part of the house, she heard screaming. She went back down to where Jess McPherson was.
And when she rushed downstairs, she found Fleming standing over Jess McPherson. And Jess was dead. Fleming had once again attacked her with the cleaver, but this time had ended her life.
The household meat cleaver had been repeatedly used to strike the servant. According to Jessie McLachlan, once more she attempted to flee the house and fetch help.
Fleming quickly said to her, "Well, you can't leave now, because if you leave, we're both going to be held responsible for this murder in effect." And then the old devil really set about showing his true nature.
Jessie would later state that Fleming bribed her to tell police that the attack had been carried out by a stranger.
As a reward, he gave her £1 and 7 shillings from his own pocket and gave her some silver plate from the house and some clothes belonging to the dead woman. And this was all designed to make the incident look as if it had been a robbery gone wrong and that those involved had killed poor Jess in the process.
He got Jessie to swear in the Bible that she wouldn't speak a word of what she had seen in the house that night.
She would keep this a secret for the rest of her days. And he also told her that, of course, if she did tell anyone, she was as guilty as he was, which wasn't quite true, but she perhaps would believe this.
Old man Fleming was left in this house over the entire weekend with a dead body downstairs. Under normal circumstances, no member of the family would answer the door because that was the job of Jess. At one occasion, the milk boy rang the bell and the old man answered the door, which was most unusual. It's not the kind of thing that would have happened in that area at that time, especially in this kind of family.
The time that the milk boy called at the house would later prove critical in court. In the meantime, Jessie McLachlan had returned to her lodgings. The weekend passed with Fleming's son and grandson in their villa on the coast, unaware of the horror that had taken place in their home.
There was quite a lot of blood around the property generally, and although old man Fleming at that point set about cleaning that blood up, he didn't clean all of it up, and certainly some was later found during the police investigation. But he made sure he cleaned himself up. He burnt his shirt, and there was evidence of that both from Jessie and also from one of the police constables who came to the house to carry out a search. And in the remains of the fire, he found a shirt button. So both of them would have been in quite a state, really. They would have been covered in blood. Jessie was clearly covered in blood. The house was covered in blood.
A girl who sometimes helped Jess McPherson with the scrubbing on a Saturday called, and also a friend of Jess, a male friend of Jess's, called twice. A neighbour called for a spade, but to none of these people did he ever mention that Jess had suddenly decamped and left him without any explanation. On the Sunday, he also attended church twice.
Mr. Fleming and his family returned from Dunoon on the Monday and went direct to work. They didn't go home, but they came home later in the afternoon after work was finished. And when they arrived at the house, they were astonished to find that Jess didn't answer the door to them, and it was old Fleming. When they asked where Jess was, he used the expression she had cut. She had gone away, and he had not seen her since the Friday and didn't know where she was.
Old Fleming was speaking in his local Aberdonian, insisting to his son and grandson that loyal servant Jess had decided to leave.
She'd cut, as he put it, in his Doric expression. They said, have you not done anything about this? And no, he hadn't. He also mentioned to them that her bedroom door was locked. However, they found a key. They managed to gain access to the bedroom, and of course there they found poor Jess McPherson lying dead on the floor of her bedroom.
It was a veritable bloodbath. It was later discovered she had more than 40 hack wounds on her head. Her forehead bone was penetrated, her nose was hanging off. She had numerous wounds to her head, her face, her neck, umpteen defensive wounds in her wrists.
Horrified, the younger Flemings knew they had no choice but to call the police. But in the end, it was left to the family butcher to do so. When officers finally arrived, old Fleming denied all knowledge of the attack. He did, however, admit to having heard strange noises on the night it had happened. Behind Sandford Place was an extensive area of waste ground.
And as that area was often frequented by drunks, women working as prostitutes, etc., he believed that it was a noise associated with that. That he'd sat up in bed, checked the time in his watch, but he hadn't investigated further.
A search of the house revealed blood in the kitchen, blood in the lobby, and there was some shirts of old Fleming were found, and they had spots of blood on them as well. And also there was some silver-plated spoons and forks missing from the household as well.
Encouraged by Fleming, Jessie McClachlan had also removed dresses belonging to the dead servant.
In the days after the murder, she gave various accounts of what had happened. And to be quite honest, she lied and prevaricated on many occasions about what had occurred.
Among the items that are missing from the house were silver plate and cutlery, which had been taken from the family, and a pawnbroker contacted the police to inform them that he was in possession of these items, which had been pawned by a lady called Mary MacDonald. The police immediately investigated, and they found out very quickly that Mary MacDonald was in fact Jesse McLachlan.
Having pawned the silver plate that Jessie brought from Sandyford Place, she then required to dispose of both her own blood-stained clothing and also Jess's clothing that she'd taken from the trunk in Jess's room. She did this by sending her own blood-stained clothing in her trunk to Hamilton to wait to be collected by the name of someone who didn't exist. And similarly, in another trunk to Ayr, she sent Jess's good clothes.
She even asked her husband to dispose of some goods and articles. He, by this time, was so concerned that he went to the police and explained what had been going on. And inevitably, this kind of behaviour drew much more attention and focus on her involvement in the case.
3 days after the murder, old Fleming was arrested and taken to prison for further questioning. But suspicion was also being levelled at McLachlan.
Thereafter, Jessie did very little to help herself. In fact, all she did was talk herself into more trouble. She gave at least 5 different statements, each of which contradicted the previous one.
The doctors doing the post-mortem determined that the wounds had been inflicted with someone who had only the strength of a woman or a weak man. They had been inflicted while she was lying on the ground by someone standing above her.
James Fleming continued to deny any part in the murder.
His position was that he had gone to bed, that he had never seen Jessie McLachlan enter the house, that he hadn't spent any time with the 2 women.
And even although her seafaring husband James earned a steady wage, focus shifted to consider what reasons Jessie McLachlan might have had to steal.
Jessie had a difficult time with her finances. More often than not, there was too much month left at the end of the money. She was always last to pay her rent. She had a history of pawnbroking. Not that that was bad, because most people, it was the only way that they could keep themselves going at the end of the month. She had loads of tickets for pawned items, but she did somehow manage to pay somebody to help her with looking after her apartment.
The Crown presented a case very much based on the fact that Jessie McLachlan was short of money, and therefore this crime, the theft of the items, and related to that the murder of Jess, was necessitated by this shortness of money.
At one point, Jessie claimed that old Fleming had asked her to pawn these goods to raise money for his holiday. Now, this was the most odd given the fact that the Flemings were an enormously wealthy family, and old Fleming had plenty of money in the bank. He could have afforded to buy any kind of holiday he wanted. This again pointed to her guilt.
The case against Jessie was mounting. But it's obvious that the connections that the police made weren't just made on their own. Someone was giving them information, and that someone was undoubtedly James Fleming, because he was the person that knew the pieces of the jigsaw, which, if they were put together in a certain way, would very much place Jessie McLachlan as the person responsible for the murder of Jess McPherson.
Jessie had told so many lies because she felt she was keeping part of a deal in death which she had with old Fleming. He had murdered the girl. She had agreed to help him cover it up. She anticipated that somewhere along the line, should the finger of suspicion point at her, old Fleming would assist her in some way. That help was never forthcoming.
My own opinion is that there was a Mrs. Campbell who lodged with Jessie McLachlan, and she let Jessie into the house at 9 o'clock in the morning when she returned from Sandford Place. I think she was suspicious about this, especially as Jessie had told her the night before that she was going up to that house to visit Jess McPherson. So my opinion, and it is only that as I say, is that Mrs. Campbell probably tipped the police off about that, and Jessie and her husband James were both arrested.
Police removed the couple from their Broomielaw lodgings on the 13th of July, a little over a week since the murder.
Now, this was a strange move in some ways, because it was well known that James McLachlan was at sea at the time of the murder. He had only returned to Glasgow in the period after the 4th of July. He was examined before the sheriff first, and then he was liberated. And Jessie was then examined and taken into custody, having been charged with the murder of Jess McPherson. But it suggested that the authorities were watching Jessie McLachlan for some time before she and her husband were arrested. And this is certainly supported by the fact that the Procurator Fiscal examined her on a number of occasions.
As far as Jessie was aware, old James Fleming was still being questioned on the basis that he was concerned with the crime. At the time, persons under actual arrest were not permitted to testify in court. Their only opportunity to present their case was in a private declaration before the sheriff.
Here we now see a picture of a woman who is in a dreadful dilemma. She's told lies in an effort to save her own back. She's covered up for a killer, and she has also disowned one of her best friends by ignoring her death and failing to mourn her properly. She found herself involved in a very complex state of affairs, because she didn't kill her friend, but she became involved in a cover-up, and as always, the cover-up is worse than the original event. She gives the impression of being a compulsive liar, somebody who was a stranger to the truth.
She denied that she had taken the silver plate. She denied that she had disposed of her own blood-stained clothing. She denied that she disposed of Jess McPherson's good clothing. On each occasion when she was examined on these matters, the authorities already had the evidence to show the contrary. And therefore, with each declaration that Jessie made, she dug a deeper hole, embedding herself both as a liar and as a person who was responsible for Jess McPherson's death.
Public interest in the case was by now running extremely high.
The case was to prove remarkable in many ways, not least the fact that for the first time in Scottish criminal history, forensic photography was used.
The gruesome scene of the crime would further point to guilt on Jessie's part.
In one part of the room, they found, I think it was 3 bloody bare footprints, which were later determined by a doctor to have been those of a female.
The final part of the picture, or nail in the coffin in establishing Jessie McLachlan's responsibility, came when a doctor visited her in prison on the Monday after her arrest.
The police then took photographs of these. Then they asked Jessie to stand in a bucket of animal blood and make impressions on another floorboard and matched the pictures to her footprints, and there was a perfect match according to them. Although perhaps not to the standards of modern forensic techniques, in those days this was regarded as cutting edge.
There were also marks on the stairs and on the lobby floor, which would, blood marks, which would indicate, the type of mark which would indicate that a lady's skirt, a woman's skirt, as women wore in those days, had been caught up in the blood and had been dragged about the house as the wearer of the skirt moved around.
In 1862, there was no defamation law, and with the multiple daily publication of newspapers, the public were fed accounts of the Sandyford murder almost by the hour. There was widespread speculation and blatant bias across the press.
The murder case was played out dramatically in public, and newspapers even took sides. There were sides which were pro-Jessie and sides which were pro-Fleming or anti-Jessie. But the papers knew that there was a great demand for this trial. There was great interest in it. They printed every word that they could get on it, and their sales increased 500% at this time.
Most murders in Glasgow were really the result of brawls between people of the lower echelons. But this murder involved members of a very respectable Glasgow family. And Glasgow did become divided on the matter, and even the local press became divided in the matter. One newspaper would take up the cause of the Flemings, the other one would take up the cause of Jessie McLachlan. One newspaper editor said at the time that he wished he could have one of these murders a month because it was sold so many papers he'd be able to retire to the south of France.
Some have commented since that it was only if you went to newspapers south of the border that you would get anything like an impartial account of the story as it was being uncovered, because sides were being taken.
Jess spent much of her incarceration calmly copying extracts from the Bible, perhaps still comforted by the belief that old James Fleming would protect her. But meanwhile, he had been freed.
When her agents or lawyers came to see her the day after Fleming had been released from prison, she asked them for confirmation of his release, and when it was provided to her, she became very distressed and said she wished to make a statement. And that was the first time that Jessie McLachlan gave what is now considered to be a true and accurate account of what happened overnight between the 4th and 5th of July here at Sandford Place.
There were thousands of words in what is considered to be Jessie McLachlan's only real statement to the authorities. In it, she gave details of what had happened on the night, admitting that drink had been taken and naming the elderly attacker who had demanded she keep quiet and help him conceal the crime.
She admitted that she had been in the house that night. She said that the person responsible for the injuries and the death of Jess McPherson was old Fleming himself. She then went on to say that she'd remained in the house that night. She'd been given the silver plate, etc. She'd taken the dresses at that time.
She names James Fleming in that statement, as the person responsible for Jess McPherson's death, and provides the detail of the conduct of James Fleming towards Jess McPherson in advance of the 4th of July, and thereby also provides for the public ear what the motivation might have been.
Old Fleming was undoubtedly the Crown's star witness in the case against Jessie McLachlan. It's reported that he gave his evidence in the Doric, the dialect that he was used to speaking, and it was probably rather difficult for some of the jurors to understand what he was on about. He did make there were certain discrepancies noticed in his evidence, and he appeared to have a very selective memory. I think perhaps allowance was made for this by the fact that he was an old man.
One critical point was the time of delivery of the milk on the Saturday morning. The young boy responsible insisted Fleming himself had opened the door to him in the early morning.
He denied initially that the milk boy had ever come and that he had ever answered the door, though that evidence was subsequently contradicted during the trial when the milk boy and his boss, who drove the cart that the milk was carried on, gave evidence to the contrary, that they had called at 20 to 8 on the morning of the 5th of July.
This was a man who didn't even know his own age. Was he 78 or was he 87? Nobody could be quite sure. Lawyers said one thing, he said another. His accent was strong. Nobody could really understand what he was saying. He contradicted himself. He couldn't recall times. He couldn't recall incidences.
Under questioning from defence lawyer Rutherford Clark, old Fleming then made a startling remark.
Eventually, James Fleming admitted yes, he had answered the door to the milk boy. And when Clark asked him, why did Jess McPherson not answer the door, he said, well, she was dead by then. It was all over by then. And when Mr. Clark again asked him, did you know she was dead by then? He then said no. So he was a wiry fox when he was giving his evidence, but not particularly convincing or coherent in places.
Efforts were made by Jessie's defence team to try and point the finger of blame in the direction of old Fleming. Efforts were made to highlight his poor character, his drinking habits, his predilection for young girls, his previous fornication with a former serving girl, which had resulted in her becoming pregnant. But all this line of questioning was stopped just as it was about to begin to find some sort of semblance of authority with the jury, who may have been convinced, but they couldn't examine any more evidence than that because the judge stopped that line of questioning and that line of evidence.
Perhaps the most blatant example of prejudice against Jessie McLachlan was the conduct of the judge, Lord Dees, nicknamed Lord Death, on the day of the verdict.
When he entered the court that Saturday morning, he carried with him his black cap. The jury were in full sight of this, and I believe, as have others have commented, that action by Lord Dees was a direction to the jury.
Given the one-sidedness of the way in which the trial was conducted, it didn't come as much surprise to learn that the jury took less than 15 minutes to return a guilty verdict. As this verdict was delivered, Jessie told the judge, "I am as innocent as my child who's only 3 years old this day." And this was actually only a prelude to a 40-minute statement that was read out on her behalf. She then relayed an entirely harrowing version of the event, relaying the entire bloody operation which was laid out before them. But the judge was infuriated by her claims and said it was a tissue of wicked falsehoods.
There was widespread anger at the verdict, which saw the young working-class mother condemned to hang.
Following Jessie's conviction and her death sentence, the public became very excited on the matter, and very quickly public opinion and support grew for a petition to be signed to have Jessie's death sentence commuted. In Glasgow alone, 50,000 signatures were on a petition, and in major towns and cities, public meetings began to be called to show support for Jessie McLachlan and to have the case reviewed. The pressure was such that the initial death sentence was delayed. Jessie was told a week before she was due to hang that the death sentence was temporarily commuted so that some investigations could be made.
There was inquiries into the evidence in the case, and the Crown authorities must have begun to think, well, perhaps there's been a mistake made here, but they didn't want to admit that, and what they did basically was they commuted her death sentence to one of life imprisonment, and she spent 15 years in prison.
Old James Fleming was fully liberated by law, but the public was to prove unforgiving.
The negative attention that James Fleming was attracting from individuals giving him abuse and abusing him was not just in Glasgow, but when he was treated to the holiday home near Dunoon, the crowds also followed him there, and there's a story of him being stoned.
There were large public meetings held in Glasgow and Edinburgh, generating petitions against the death sentence. Eventually, a closed-doors inquiry was carried out by the Crown Commissioner. In prison, McLachlan began to change her story once more.
Her behaviour was odd, which is possibly not too strange given what had happened to the woman. She may have been psychologically scarred or traumatised by what had happened to her. There were suggestions that she had confessed again to being involved in the murder, but nobody's really sure about the truth of that or the veracity of these claims. Nothing really could be tested properly.
But the lawyers, by their own account, say that this statement was made with some hysteria, and that at the end of it she said to the lawyer, of course none of that's true, I only said that to see what your face looked like.
If she'd been honest from the outset, if she'd told the truth, if she'd failed to cover up, if she had given an honest version of events, perhaps she wouldn't have been in the trouble she got herself into, and perhaps she would have seen her young son grow up.
In view of Jessie McLachlan's conduct in the wake of the murder, her duplicity, her trying to dispose of Jess McPherson's clothing, her own clothing that could have convicted her or could have put her at the place of the murder, in view of all that, I think really she was her worst enemy.
She didn't have connections, she didn't have influence to be able to access that sort of justice. And indeed she'd said herself, if I had money, I would be walking free too. Now, after all these years, after Jess's murder, when new employees come along and they're going to be working in this space in the basement, is that a point of discussion at interview to see if they've got the nerve for it?
I think I like that question, but no, I don't think we highlight that out to them when we sort of decide to employ them. And it's probably fair to say that unless someone mentions it in passing, no, they probably won't know about it. But with you chaps having been here over the last few days, I think it's fair to say that there might be a few interesting questions, and maybe people will not be working late at night from now on.
So to a certain extent, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive, and I think that applies very much to Jessie McLachlan. And although I think she was innocent of the actual murder, I have to say that to some extent she was the author of her own misfortune.